morning, everybody. It's great to see you all. Thanks for joining us from all over the world. We got folks in, I'm looking here, Ireland, Seattle, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, the D.school, Sri Lanka, Dallas, Michigan, Romania, San Diego, Kansas City, Brazil, UK, Sacramento, Colorado. Incredible to see so many amazing lifelong learners join us today. We are delighted to get to showcase an incredible special guest, a special guest who needs no introduction, but I will introduce her nonetheless. I know that you all know who I've got with me today. This is Trier Bryant. Please wave so that folks can see. Yeah, can we see you now? Okay, good. We can see it. Everybody wave to Trier. Yeah, that's the beauty of, that's the beauty of Zoom. We can wave. Today, we're going to have a riveting discussion about what are practical ways that we can see and seize opportunities to advance workplace justice in the workplace. And there are very few people in the world I know as qualified to lead this conversation as Trier. She's got leadership experience in the military, in financial services, in tech. She's an influential DEI practitioner who's been featured in publications and outlets from USA Today to CNN to South by Southwest. And she is the co-founder and CEO of Just Work. We're excited to dig into the Just Work framework. And then we'd also love it if you want to drop into the chat questions or experiences you've had as you faced workplace injustice or workplace justice opportunities in your place of work. We'd love for this to be a rich and vibrant conversation. We're going to spend about half the time hearing from Trier about her experience and framework and some of the experiences that shaped her passion for this space. And then we're going to open it up to a conversation. We'd love to hear from many of you about your experiences and address the questions that you've got. So with that, Trier, I'll pass it over to you, and I'll be monitoring the chat. I'll let you know if we need to redirect or divert and address anything that's coming up for folks.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here with you all today. I really want to jump right into this because I love hearing questions, getting to understand what it is that you all would love to take away from this content and from this time. This is really all about you. I do want to share, though, one thing about the organization and why I am passionate about this work. Just Work is not only Kim Scott's second book, The Framework, but it is also the name of the company. And we do broader things beyond working with organizations and leaders, putting this framework into practice. We also do diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting and people HR advisory services. But why do I say that? People are like, how does all that fit together, Trier? This is how it fits together. When I was in the military, they say, mission first, people always. And they say, you take care of your people, and your people take care of the mission, which is basically everything else. And when I transitioned out of the military to Goldman Sachs, I was pretty critical about how Goldman defined taking care of their people. You have to remember that in the military, taking care of your people is an extension also of your family. When you're deployed, your family is getting checked in on. I had troops where they had high school students that were dealing with, anorexia, bulimia, and we were right there with them handling that. You can't pay. One of the reasons why they give military members all kinds of loans is because if you're having financial issues, you can go to the commander and they will pay their bills for you, right? So taking care of your people in the military and having professionally grown up in that environment really helped shape what I define and what I receive as an organization taking care of their people. Now, even though I was critical at Goldman, let me tell you what happened when I transitioned to tech and started at Twitter. I was actually very appreciative and tried running back to Goldman for that opportunity to have an organization take care of us. And that is really where I have spent my time, transitioning into chief HR roles, chief people officer roles. While I have such intense passion for diversity and inclusion and equity, which is something that, happy to take questions on and talk about, the work that we really do is how do we take care of our people so that they can take care of the work, so they can just work and do the best work of their lives, and we can optimize for their talent, because there's so many missed opportunities in our organizations that prevent us from doing that. So let's talk about some of the root causes on how that gets in the way. Can you all see my screen?
It looks perfect, Trier.
Okay, great. So just work, getting shit done fast and fair. Let's talk about what just work is. If you know Kim Scott and you're familiar with Radical Candor, Kim Scott really truly believes that every problem in the world can be solved by a 2x2. So this is the 2x2 for just work. Just work is when we optimize for collaboration versus coercing our organizations and people on our teams and respecting individuality. Now, what does that look like if we're not demanding conformity? I will give you an example that happens time and time again, and you all may have either observed this or actually been the person that might have caused this type of harm in this way. Everyone is focused on diversity hiring, having more representation on their teams. And we get so excited when we have that representation and we bring them into our organization. They come from different backgrounds, they sit at different intersections, and they're bringing all of that into our team. Yet when they show up, we say, welcome to the team. This is how we communicate. This is how we execute. This is how we operate. This is how we do everything in the organization. That is a version of demanding conformity and not allowing this diverse talent and all the different experiences that they bring and how they can execute and get things done, allowing them to bring that into the organization. And so when we can optimize for collaboration and we're not coercing people and we can respect individuality, that's when we create the conditions for a just work environment where everyone can do the best work of their lives and we can optimize for that talent. Now, one of the superpowers of humans is our ability to collaborate. And that's why it's so important that we optimize for that and get that right within organizations. However, when we have harm in the workplace, it's really hard for us to work with one another. It becomes that invisible tax and that burden and prevents us from asking questions, engaging, pushing back, being innovative, not just having a seat at the table, but how do we have that voice at the table as well? So before we get into the root causes of the workplace injustice, let's discuss whose role it is to address these issues. But stop, it's everyone's role. Everyone has a role and a responsibility. So let's talk about the 4 key roles. In any situation, you can be the person harmed, and the person harmed has the role and responsibility to choose a response. This is really important because it's the only role we feel that we don't want to take away your agency, but we feel like you have a choice to respond. Sometimes there are moments, I can tell you I've experienced plenty of them, where it's just in that moment, I don't have the capacity or the energy to call someone in on their bias. We call it calling them in versus calling them out, calling someone on their bias, or standing up against a prejudice or a bullying situation, right? But you get to choose a response if you're the person harmed. The next role is an upstander, and that is where we need everyone to be an upstander. An upstander is a bystander that goes into action and intervenes, right? They are there to intervene. But the key thing about being an upstander is we are not standing up for the person. This isn't like a damsel in distress or a white savior complex type of a situation. You are intervening and you are standing up to the injustice. So think about that the next time you have the opportunity to be an upstander. We are empowering everyone to move into action and to be an upstander. Yeah, start getting your stories ready because we're going to have an opportunity to share them. The next role are people who cause harm. We've all been there, regardless of how we identify our intersections. We've all caused harm the way that we've also experienced harm. And so those who have caused harm, their role is to listen, right? Listen what's going on and get that feedback and address the situation. But really listening and taking it as an opportunity, as a learning opportunity so that we can do better. And then finally, leaders. Leaders have a responsibility to prevent this harm in the workplace from occurring. And that's where the book really, really digs deep, and we work with organizations of what are those solutions? What's the change management behind that? And how do we actually get there with your teams and your organizations? Now, it's inevitable that these things are going to occur. We're humans. We deal with humans in our organization every day, and humans can be unpredictable. However, we have to then, when we notice it and we recognize the harm that's happening in the workplace, we have to address to prevent it because we don't want it to metastasize to something larger and bigger. And we'll talk about that in a second when power is introduced into the equation. So let's talk about the root causes of workplace injustice. We name the root causes as bias, prejudice, bullying. And the simple definitions that we use are bias is not meaning it, prejudice is meaning it, and bullying is being mean with the intent to cause harm. So if bias is not meaning it, that's unconscious. Prejudice is meaning it, means it's a conscious belief that you actually believe a harmful stereotype. And bullying is being mean with the intent to cause harm, where sometimes like people are just jerks, right? So what's really interesting about this is if you had asked me before meeting Kim and really understanding the book and the framework, Trier, have you ever been bullied in your career? I would say no. Like, have you met me? Like, you come for me, I'm gonna come for you, right? I haven't been bullied in my career outside of like, military boot camp. But then Kim is like, well, Trier, bullying is just being mean. And then I was like, oh, I have actually been bullied a lot in my career. But because I couldn't name it, I never stood up for myself. I never asked anyone to be held accountable. And I never went to an organization to do anything about it. And so we have to detangle the problems and name them so that we all can do it in a simplistic way so that we know what solutions and what to do in these cases, right? And it's just so interesting, like this quick framework, like I can already see people's faces, like you're thinking about your own bias encounters or prejudice or bullying encounters, and in those various different roles, right? And these type of situations can move very quickly. I mean, I've been in a 30-minute meeting where someone has said something biased to me. I probably said someone harmful and bullied someone else. I was a leader and I didn't prevent another bias situation from occurring. And I was an upstander to someone to a situation where I felt like prejudice is being had. These things can move very, very quickly, right? But with these simple definitions in this framework, it helps us to really understand how these show up in different scenarios. So bias. We all have our own bias stories, but I will share one. I was gotten an Uber once on my way to Twitter to go to work when I was at Twitter. And I live pretty close, but like, I don't walk anywhere. Let's just be serious. So I jump in the Uber on my way and the driver said, hey, I know you're going to Market Street. Isn't that, where Twitter HQ is? And I said, yeah, I work at Twitter. And the driver said, oh, I didn't know that Twitter had a call center. They don't. Twitter doesn't have a call center, but that was at bias. Did someone come off mute?
Yeah, we got it. No worries.
Okay. If someone was like, oh my gosh, no, they didn't. Exactly. Right. So they said, hey, I didn't know Twitter had a call center. So there was that bias. Did they mean that? No, but there was bias and it was harmful of making that assumption that, a Black woman in San Francisco working at a tech company that I worked at Twitter and also was the recruiting lead. And then he tried to ask me for a job after that when I told him what I did. Probably didn't follow up with that nice young gentleman, but that's okay, right? So bias can show up, right, in these very, unpredictable, very easy ways. So, but what do we say when we don't know what to say in those situations? We want to use an I statement. So in that moment, we want to bring people in and we want to use an I statement, bringing them in and letting them know, hey, what is going on? So I can say, hey, I actually don't work in a call center. I'm a recruiting leader at Twitter, or I don't think you meant that the way it sounded, right? So I statement brings someone in to let them know how you're feeling and the perspective of that situation. Prejudice, though, is something different because we're going to need something a little stronger. I worked at a company where we were interviewing for a new recruiting leader. And at the end, like most organizations do, we had a hiring debrief. In that debrief, it became very clear based off of everyone's feedback that the top candidate for that day was a Black woman that came and wore her natural hair out. And her hair was beautiful. I mean, I asked her for a hair regimen afterwards. It was amazing. However, the hiring manager, who is a white woman, said, I don't think we're going to move forward with offer. And so, of course, if that's the strongest candidate, the interviewers, we said, hey, like, we're going to, like, why not? And the interviewer said, the hiring manager said, well, Trier, her hair doesn't look like ours. We can't put her in front of the business with her hair like that. Now, at the time, I was not wearing my beautiful locks. I had extensions in and my hair was straight. And quite frankly, I'll be honest, I felt pressure. I felt that was needed at Goldman Sachs. I never wore my hair natural out at Goldman Sachs. I actually didn't wear my natural hair out until 14 years into my professional career. So with that being said, this hiring manager, that's prejudice. They meant it. They believed that they could not put a Black woman in front of the business to get the job done because they wore their natural hair. So that is a huge difference in bias and prejudice. Then you've got bullying, and bullying is just being mean. And this can show up in all different types of ways. I acknowledge that I come from a family that talks over each other, military that talks over each other, and being on the trading floor of Wall Street. So I am very good, and I'm comfortable when people interrupt me, talk over me, and I talk over folks. I don't mean any disrespect, but I can understand that at times I do need to pause and listen in meetings. I was in a meeting once and someone said, Trier, you keep interrupting me. If you could just let me finish my point. I think that's valid feedback. I said, you're right. You should finish your point. Then I said, are you done? Can I make my next point? They said, yes. So I start making my point. As I was making my point, she then proceeds to interrupt me. And I said, if we're going to give each other the space to talk, it should be equitable. And then she proceeded to yell at me in this meeting full of senior leaders saying, you keep interrupting me, you're not making the point, so forth and so on. And she was just quite frankly being mean. I didn't take it as bullying in that moment, again, because I didn't have this framework and think of it in that way. But was there harm done? And it was mean. And was it distracting to me in that moment? Absolutely. So these are ways where it shows up. And again, it prevents folks from doing their best work. So in bullying, we encourage folks to use a you statement. A you statement focuses the bullying on the other person. Hey, you can't talk to me that way. Or what's going on with you right now? I don't think that you mean to show up or act in this way, but you pushes them away. And Kim has a really great story about who taught her this, which is really interesting because I feel like I've told my nieces the same thing. Kim's daughter was getting bullied at school. She came home and she was telling her about it. And so Kim said, well, when someone bullies you, you should say, I feel sad when you bully me. And Kim's daughter, who's brilliant, by the way, pounds her fist on the table and says, Mom, why would I tell them that they're making me feel sad when that's what they're trying to do? And Kim was like, that's actually a really good point. And then she, thought about that in the workplace as well. So you puts that back on them and pushes them away and doesn't give them that power to do that harm. I'm quickly going to go back to prejudice of what folks can say, the statement for prejudice. With prejudice, we encourage you to say an it statement. So an it statement focuses on the prejudice. And when you have an it statement, you can think about, either leaning in and having it apply to company policy. So it is against our hiring policy not to extend an offer to a candidate who, is for a reason that's not in the job description, or the law. It is illegal in 11 states, but hopefully passed at the federal level to discriminate against someone because of how they wear their hair in the workplace. Or common sense. It is ridiculous that we would not hire someone because of the way they wear their hair. So when we have these root causes, language that you can add to your toolkit is an I statement with bias, inviting someone in, an it statement with prejudice that focuses on the prejudice, and then a you statement with bullying that invites them in. Very quickly, we're going to talk about what leaders can do in these situations as well, with a bigger focus on bias interrupters. If you've seen our TED Talk, Nia can drop it into the chat. Kim and I did a TED Talk and then Ashley spoke at TED this past couple of weeks in Vancouver about how do you disrupt bias. And so what bias interrupters are is a way in real time to disrupt the bias, because there's one thing that we know about bias, that bias is a pattern. So because it is a pattern, that means that we can disrupt it and we can change that behavior. There's three things that you need to create these bias interrupters and disruptors in your organizations. First is you need a shared language, shared vocabulary. It's a word, a phrase, or even a gesture that whenever someone does it on the team, everyone knows that they just noticed bias. We have teams that use stoplight, stop sign, biased alert. There's one team that throws up a peace sign and everyone sees that and everyone knows. At Just Work, we say purple flag. Kim has literally bought purple flags. I just have a purple Post-it note or drop a purple square in the chat in Zoom, right? After that happens, everyone knows that bias has been noticed. But then what happens? That's where the discomfort comes. What happens after that is we need shared norms of what occurs next. The first thing that we recommend folks to do is say thank you. It takes courage to call someone in on their bias. And so thanking them for that really opens up for more engaging conversation and just creates that space, right? After that, you're going to say one of two things. Either, yes, Jeremy, thank you for flagging my language. I've been working on using more inclusive language and not saying guys. Hold me accountable. Or, Actually, Jeremy, I'm not quite sure what you flagged. Let's connect after the meeting so I understand better what you were calling me in on. The other great thing in Zoom is that you can drop a link or you can just drop the explanation right in Zoom. The meeting keeps going. Everyone can read it, have that learning moment, and then keep going. So having your shared vocabulary, purple flag, shared norm, thanks for flagging, I get it, or I don't get it, let's talk about it later so we can continue the work. And then the third thing is a shared commitment. A shared commitment is, look, once you start doing this, I assure you that bias, you will start to notice bias much more. A commitment that in every meeting, that bias is flagged at least once. And if at the end of the meeting, bias isn't flagged, that there's time to pause and we can actually have a conversation and go back over some language. So if at the end of this, I don't see any purple flags or anything, and I throw purple flags on myself all the time, then like, let's have a conversation about it. But I'm sure that someone will throw a purple flag. And if you want to come off mute and explain it, we are happy to create that feedback environment. So that's what bias interrupters are, because we have to disrupt that bias in real time when it happens, again, so we don't allow it to perpetuate. When it comes to prejudice, organizations and leaders have to have a code of conduct. A code of conduct is a line in the sand. Look, we all can believe whatever we want to believe, but people cannot come into our organizations and force those beliefs on others, right? We have to be very clear with the code of conduct, what people can say and do and what people cannot say or do. And one of the things that we actually encourage leaders to do is to pressure test your code of conduct. And don't get too wrapped up on the language of code of conduct. This can show up in your values. There's a lot of different artifacts or things that organizations have. But the point is are you very clear? And are you very direct on letting folks know what they can and cannot do in your organization? And a way to pressure test that is literally ripping things from the headlines. Or what we do is we pressure test with our clients of things that we know have happened with our clients. So next time you see something that happens, a Coinbase, or whatever thing in the news, pressure test what artifacts and what language you have at your organization and what would happen there. And then again, we want to use that it statement. For bullying, we have to have consequences. And I will tell you, as a previous chief people officer, this is one of the hardest things for leaders to do, because oftentimes it's the brilliant jerk that is causing the most harm in your organizations. But you have to create consequences, and there's 3 types of consequences. One is conversational consequences. Conversational consequences are removing that platform from them so that they no longer can cause that harm. I worked at a company once where the CEO used all hands to berate people and to call people out and was bullying directly to employees. I told him he was no longer to speak. He was no longer allowed to speak at the all hands for 3 months. Did we fight about it? Yes, but I would definitely got him over the line on that. So removing that platform so he could no longer cause that harm. And second type of consequence are compensation. We shouldn't be paying the brilliant jerk more, right? Most people care about their money. And so if you hit them where the money is, it's gonna get their attention. The third are career consequences. That can be promotions, feedback, or exiting them out of the organization. If you cannot change that behavior through these consequences, then you need to exit them out of the organization. There's this pivotal moment that Kim talks about where the jerks win, the brilliant jerks win, and the bullies win in an organization. And it's really, really hard to recover from that once you get to that point. So we don't want to get to that point. We want to be able to ensure that we have those consequences. And as a chief people officer, I always ensure that folks know, that your employees know what the consequences are before you have to implement them, before you have to use those consequences. So they know it's coming and all expectations are managed. And that's, again, where we want to use the you statement with bullying as well. Now, we have to talk about power, because power is important. And this creates, workplace injustice and that harm is bad. This is even worse. So what happens when power enters the equation? So that's where we get discrimination, harassment, and physical violations. And we don't want power to corrupt our organizations. So when we have bullying or prejudice plus power, it creates the conditions for discrimination. When we have bullying plus power, it creates the conditions for harassment, and touch plus power is what creates those physical violations. So going back to the hair example of prejudice, because that hiring manager had the power, the hiring decision, that's how quickly saying, oh, I don't think that we can put a Black woman in front of the business with her natural hair to do her job, and now she's not going to get that job. That's how quickly prejudice can turn into discrimination, right? And so with this, we encourage folks to buy it, to quantify your bias, right? You have to measure what matters. You have to measure your bias. And let me tell you something. We work with organizations all the time. We have an event coming up with Lattice in San Francisco, if anyone would like to join us. But you all are probably leaders and you work at organizations that say, we are data-driven, we are data-driven. And then we come in and go, great, let's measure your bias across your entire employee lifecycle. And do you know what most leaders do? They are so reluctant. They are so reluctant to do that when you know that it's there. One, it's not going to be good news. That's okay. But as a leader, we should want to know where those problem areas are. In every other place in your organization, you want to know where the problems are so you can address it, whether it's revenue, your product, engineering. It should be the same thing when it comes to our people. Let's understand where those gaps are. Let's understand where those problems are so we can put the right solutions in place. And you can literally measure your bias across the entire life cycle. Who are you interviewing? Who are you hiring? Who actually makes it to the offer stage? Who doesn't? Who's accepting offers? Who's not, right? Who's getting promoted? Who's getting paid? Who's exiting your organization? I mean, all across your entire employee life cycle, there's ways to quantify your bias. With harassment, we need checks and balances, right? We should not have unilateral authority. Checks and balances are key to holding people accountable so that that power and that bullying doesn't create a situation for harassment, right? So even though in that meeting, that person they didn't have that power where it turned into harassment. However, there were other instances where senior leaders were talking, bullying in meetings, and it did turn into harassment, right? And so again, we need to be able to identify that and communicate that. Physical violations. We need to have a culture of consent. Kim tells a story that every time she tells it just grosses me out, but she was at a company and she was on a team and they were giving a presentation at like all hands, and there was a couple hundred people in the audience, and they were talking about this really great project that they were working on. And a senior leader was introducing the team, and it was her, and there were 3 men on the team. The leader introduces the 3 men, says their names, and then when he introduces Kim, he grabs Kim's hand to kind of like kiss it, but instead of kissing it, he kind of like licks her hand, like super gross, right? I know, right? It's just so gross. But the craziest part of that is that that happened in front of hundreds of people and no one said anything to Kim. Talk about the power of being an upstander. No one said anything to the senior leader. No one said anything to Kim. So what Kim got in that moment is that she walked away feeling like, hey, maybe that's okay. Maybe I'm the outlier here and I just think that that's weird, but that's okay. And that she was questioning the culture of consent. And so culture of consent right now, even in this COVID environment, down to the handshake, great to meet you all, but I'm never shaking another hand. If you saw me at TED or anywhere else, like I'm elbowing it out all the time, right? Probably never shaking another hand. But what are we doing with the handshake? Or even in a meeting before, if you were like, Trier, let me borrow your pen. I'd be like, yeah, sure, whatever, just give it back because it's my favorite. Now you ask to borrow a pen, you can have it. It's totally fine. It's fine. I'll get another one, right? So the culture of consent down to like borrowing a pen or shaking someone's hand, organizations need to think about that. And we need to be very explicit. We did a workshop for senior executive HR professionals, about 30. And we asked the question, how many of you have a culture of consent? They all raised their hand, right? However, we said, how many of you have an explicit culture of consent that's written down and you could pull up and read to us right now? 0, not a single one. So we need to have an explicit culture of consent that's written down where everyone can read it. It's not left up for interpretation. Because again, if I asked you in your organizations, do you have a culture of consent? Yeah, everyone would say yes. But what does that mean? And for us, we have actually several examples, but for us, we define a culture of consent that it is a responsibility of the toucher to know if a person wants to be touched. If they don't want to be touched, don't touch. If you don't know, don't touch. Now, let me tell you, my niece in kindergarten, I saw her where she would go up and ask people for a hug. If our kids in kindergarten and elementary school can understand this, we as adults in the workplace have got to figure this out, because this is still such an issue in the workplace and in professional settings. Trusted reporting systems also, lawyers also need to put in trusted reporting systems. This is actually very personal to me because of the military. When I was in the military, we did a whole overhaul on how we reported sexual assault and sexual violence in the military. The changes that we made were poor changes. They were such poor changes that the first time that we looked at the data, the numbers had gone down. And some senior leaders said, oh, that means incidences are going down, right? We're finally shifting the culture. It's not what was happening. It was just that there wasn't a trusted reporting system anymore that those that were harmed felt comfortable reporting to. So if you don't know what's happening in your organizations, then you can't do anything about it. I sit on the board of a nonprofit where we actually just had an incident earlier this week where a senior leader had an inappropriate engagement with an employee. The employee called the CEO and said, hey, I'm just not sure. I'm not sure was enough for us to say, pause, right? Pause work, pause going to this offsite. We're doing an investigation with a third party. That's all it took. And there wasn't a question of like, well, what does that mean? Or so forth and so on, right? So we have to take these things seriously. And because it also sends a message to your folks on what is tolerated in the organization and what is not. Okay. Before we jump into questions, I really want to go back, and I'm going to go back to this. All right. Would love for someone to come off mute and share a bias story. Bias, not meaning it. And so when you share the story, tell us what role you played, what role you think you played, and then what was the context of the story? Bias story. Who's got one?
Hey, I can share mine.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Jeremy and Trier. I did post it on the chat, and I am just so much working on just letting it go. I did share it. It happened 5 years ago, and it was just so off-putting. I was invited by my VP of sales to a lunch, right? But I couldn't finish my meal because I normally don't eat that much, and I don't waste food. So I requested a to-go container, but I mean, the comment I got from him was, oh, you need to take this because you didn't have that much food back home, right? This condescending, patronizing tone that still gets me to this day, because it's not only biased towards, I'm a Mexican and I'm in Canada right now. I shared with Jeremy that I couldn't really react. It was just, he took me so off ground. I didn't expect that from a Canadian. First of all, that was my bias. I have a nice stereotype about Canadians. That was first. Then he made it look like so normal. So it made me doubt that I was feeling offended by that comment, like you just mentioned. Exactly. Why was I feeling bad about this? And then third, he was a figure of authority for me. So I didn't really have the tools to reply or say anything. I just totally froze.
You didn't feel like you were empowered to.
Yeah, not at all. So maybe that's why I still hold this grudge. I didn't say anything at that moment, but I'm still pissed.
I didn't catch the beginning. How do you pronounce your name? I'm really big on names.
That's okay. My name is Citlali.
Citlali?
Yep.
That's beautiful. Citlali, thank you for sharing that story. And that is a bias story, right? But again, the harm that it caused, and you said this is like a couple of years ago.
Oh yeah,
5 years ago. And the fact that, this harm, people carry it. And what we try to get leaders to understand is, it's like if you get one mosquito bite, it itches, it's annoying, but you can go on. But imagine if you're getting bit all day and you have 100 mosquito bites all over your body every day. Are you going to be effective? No. And that is what this harm looks like for folks in organizations. And there are people that experience this every day, every meeting, and sometimes every hour in your organizations. And so that's why leaders need to prevent this from happening, because I guarantee you, you are not getting your best from folks if this is what they are experiencing in the workplace. Francisco, did you have a prejudice story or a question?
I have two quick stories. One is a bias. I'm a member of the local club here in Dallas. I'm not going to say the name just to keep it safe. The largest in town. We do a lot of social activities. We help a lot of people and institutions. And one bias comment. Now I know it was bias because you explained that this is a lady, nice lady. We interact a lot. She came to me once and say, "Hey, I recommend so-and-so to call you because they need a roofer. And since you're a Mexican, you should know a lot of roofers, right?" And I was like, okay, no, but that's bias. But she didn't mean anything wrong, but she kind of put me in a box like, you are a Mexican, then you are related to construction, and you should have a lot of roofers in your circle. I didn't like that. I'm a Mexican, born and raised, and came here 20 years ago, but that's bias. One. The second one that really hit me hard is last week. There is this gentleman who's been in the club for so long, and he wanted this lady to be the president, the chairman of this particular chapter. And she deserves it. She's awesome. She works more than anybody else. And send this email. She says, okay, thank you so much. I will accept this position. And then the guy starts saying, hey, so we can invite some Chippendales to your inauguration, and they start dancing around you. And I was in shock, like, what? And this is an email sent it to about 6 to 8 people. She's the only woman. And everybody is white, old, and nobody says anything. And I had to reach out to her that night, say, you know what? I apologize for that because I have nothing to do with it. I don't support it. I think it's very disrespectful. And it really, really hit me. And she came back saying, thank you, Francisco, for being in my corner. It's something that I've been dealing with. I already talked to him multiple times. He doesn't get it. He continues doing that. Yeah. They don't understand. They don't see themselves how they look when they talk like that. Yeah. And it's something that I have in my head for the last week, trying to think if I should step up or not, because
an upstander, absolutely stand up to that harm. Francisco, thank you for sharing those two stories, and I hate that first story had happened to you. Your second story is a really great example, though, that shows that the collateral damage that occurs when harm happens. We oftentimes only think of the person who is harmed, that was on the receiving end, but those who observe it, like, it's uncomfortable, right? Francisco, like, I'm still thinking about this. And so we have to think about that as well, is the collateral damage and the downstream impact that this has. It's not just one for one. It's not just the person who caused the harm and the person who is harmed. Like, it can be, really felt throughout a team and an organization. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for listening.
Who has a bullying story? I know that there are so many and they exist. You can raise your hand. Suti, I'm looking at your comment in the chat. It says, I can't come off mute right now, but I'm Indian. I'm Indian, and when I'm in the gym, I had a woman come up to me and ask me, were you raped as a child? All Indian women are raped. That's terrible, and I am so sorry that happened. I appreciate folks that have their cameras on, because seeing your reactions, it's like really good. These sharing stories help us all learn. And I think that there's a lot of folks, particularly from like majority groups, that don't hear these stories often enough, but they can become learning moments for all of us. But these things do occur, this harm does occur. Stuti, and I hope that I'm saying your name correctly, I can relate to that because I had someone come and ask me, so I'm so sorry for, the sexual trauma that you experienced in the military. And I was like, why are you making the assumption that I did? And they were like, oh, well, that's the number one reason and the main reason that women get out of the military is because of sexual trauma and rape. And I said, that's actually not the number one reason. And then she proceeded to argue with me, which I'm a woman veteran. I'm not quite sure like who you're going to talk to about like whatever, right? Anyways, but it was just this really awkward moment. And then I was like, is that what people really think? And like, is that a bias that people have? I'd never heard of that one before, but she was really trying to show empathy and compassion in a place that it didn't need to be. Okay. Then let's, does someone have a bias story that they want to raise your hand?
I can, maybe I could speak to one that was and just anonymize it because someone messaged me something. Oh, sorry, Leonore, maybe why don't we go with you if you're ready to represent something, please.
Hi, I can't see myself, but hopefully you guys can.
Yes, you can.
Thank you for this wonderful
Leonore,
chat.
oh, this is perfect. Purple flag.
Purple flag?
Purple flag, you said, I hope you guys can see me. And inclusive language. So you folks,
oh, guys.
all, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you all can see me. So I work for the last 7 years, I've worked in diversity, equity, and inclusion in a legacy media company. And now I'm off doing my own thing, recruiting with a startup. And some of the persistent bias I've seen and heard very openly, because I think people have trouble placing me, like, where is she? Who is she? What's her background? So I've heard many folks say, why do candidates of color have trouble acing a writing test? Because there are often writing tests involved with media jobs. And why do all the white people seem to ace the test and do well? And so that's an inherent bias in the system. And I've heard it in many different roles I've had. And sometimes I have a great answer for that. And by now I've been able to talk people through this bias on some level, but would love your thoughts on how you've handled or talked to folks about that kind of bias. And I know we talked a little bit about hair, which is different, but that's one that keeps coming up repeatedly over the last 7 years and predates me, I'm sure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's one of the things that I have found helpful are asking open-ended question to folks. So oftentimes, when folks have these biases or prejudice, but that's a prejudice, like they believe that. Tell me about that. Where does that come from? And oftentimes people start stuttering and stumbling over their words because they have no data, they have no facts. It's something anecdotal, it's that one experience, or someone told them, or they're just repeating something that they've heard. And so it's an opportunity to break that down, right? And then also, and I think because I similarly work in this space of all the data and facts of how much incredibly bright, brilliant talent, underrepresented talent there is, right? But that folks are choosing to opt out of going into certain industries, particularly tech, because a lot of underrepresented folks in tech are surviving, they're not thriving. And so why would you be in a place where you are just surviving instead where you can go somewhere and you can thrive? The other thing that I want to flag, which I think is just important, is like language is incredibly important. And there's a lot of language that causes harm, but we also tiptoe around things and there's discomfort with certain words. And so I challenge you all to say what you mean and to get comfortable with language. So for example, at Just Work, we encourage folks not to use the terms people of color, women of color, and for sure not BIPOC. I'm happy to get into that if anyone cares. But I bet if I did a survey right now, or if you just drop into the chat, when you say people of color, who are you talking about? People will have different answers. Because people have different answers of how that's defined, it gets very ambiguous very quickly. Some people will say, oh, I mean Black and Hispanic Latine folks. Oh, I mean everyone that's non-white. Oh, I mean all non-white folks. Oh, but it's not Asians. So there's like this, lots of people define this in all different types of ways. So just say what you mean. If you mean non-white people, say non-white. If you mean, Black and Hispanic Latine, say that. Be empowered and feel comfortable saying that language. We have like a whole workshop on language because there's a lot of nuance to it and it's constantly evolving. But it's super, super important that we use that language because it really goes a long way and it can make people feel very comfortable. The other thing that we recommend is that when you're having these conversations, simply saying, as a Black woman veteran, as a white Jewish man, as a Korean man, right? By leading with your intersections and your identities, it tells people that you're aware of it and that that's your lens and you're speaking from that lens. And it also opens it up for others to speak from their perspective and lens as well, right? And so just thinking about that when you're talking, it really goes a long way. I want to quickly I know someone said BIPOC. So one of the things that we say often is that inclusion has to be inclusive. And oftentimes even organizations most brilliant and strongest DE&I efforts are actually exclusive. And so that is the reason why we don't use BIPOC, because why would we call out Black and Indigenous and then lump people of color again? What does that mean? And so it's not equitable and it's not inclusive. And it also, if you're familiar with the pyramid of white supremacy, it perpetuates this centering whiteness. And so again, being white is fine and we need to own that. And when more white people can acknowledge hey, I am white, then that lets others know that you can notice and you acknowledge other people's ethnicities and heritage and race and everything else. And so that's why we don't encourage folks to use BIPOC. Say what you mean, and we don't lump people of color together because all those experiences are so nuanced and so different that it's harmful, and it's also just disrespectful to make the assumption that it's white and then everything else. So that's why we don't use that. Also, I didn't say purple flag, but I've been working on my sloppy site metaphors. So instead of saying see, notice. I didn't say purple flag, but I was about to say see, and then I said notice. Okay. Is there any, I think maybe 2 more questions, if there's anyone that wants to come off of mute or ask a question.
I just say that I really have one thing I'll say while folks are kind of maybe building the courage to share. Actually, John, you've got a question here. Let's give it to John. It's John's question. It says, curious to hear what employees can do when a leader's biases and prejudice create unjust working environments, when the person with the most power and least accountability are creating cultures that encourage workplace injustices.
Yeah, so we actually talk with leadership teams and executive teams, what happens when it's happening at the top or from a board, and there has to be checks and balances. And so one of the things that we encourage, and you should ask these questions, you should ask your people leader, what happens when it's a member of the exec team that's causing this harm? What is the protocol? What's happened when it's a board member that's causing this harm? And we've actually done a lot of workshops, particularly with we did a workshop for the association of museum directors. And my goodness, their boards are bullies apparently. And this is something that was a consistent theme throughout. And we spent so much time digging into it. And so asking, like, it's the same thing. There has to be checks and balances, and there has to be, again, before you need to go into that protocol or take those steps, what would you do? Like, these are conversations that should be had before it actually occurs. But also, leaders need to be told that checks and balances will be put into place and checking their power. Also, the more leaders that understand this framework, being conscious of their power, right, and not abusing that power. But what I will say is that I have exited a VP of engineering from an organization because they were a bully. It took time to get the board across the line, but what finally got them there is we were losing talent left and right, and so we did exit a VP of engineering. So they are not excluded from those consequences. Nia's sending me some questions in the chat. How does the culture of consent work in a healthcare patient staff environment? Ooh, that is a really great question. That I would love for you to send me an email on that I can answer that. And so my email is just trier@justworktogether.com. I would love to have that conversation with you. The reason why that is because on our roadmap, we are talking about how does the Just Work framework go into healthcare and medicine. And I personally feel that way just because I have not started my family yet, but the rates of Black women of death in childbearing are so far over the average, and also for other races. And so there's just there's so much prejudice, there's so much harm that happens in the medical system. So I would actually love to answer that and have a conversation about that. How can we access some of your great work, your website? Yeah, you can go to our website, justworktogether.com. And if you wanna, talk to us, you can ask a question, or we can talk about, how we engage with organizations. And, we work with companies and organizations across across different industries and stuff. Is there any term you'd substitute for BIPOC, Indiana, non-white, or some such, or just someone? Yeah, non-white, but I use that equitably. I've used non-Black, I've used non-Hispanic, Latina, non-queer. Again, it's just empowering of what you want to say. Also, if you want to, I don't know this audience, but I'll share something that I saw yesterday that has just lit a fire under me, to say the least. Someone who
purple flag.
Oh, what?
You saw something yesterday, or you noticed something yesterday?
I noticed something. Thank you, Nia. I noticed something yesterday when I was someone who has worked for me that I've hired 2 times. They're very excited to get a new role at Coinbase. And they said, I'm going to put you down for reference. Of course, anytime. I'm going through the questions on the reference, and there's 4 mandatory questions. One of the mandatory questions is, if you're familiar with Coinbase's values, they say mission first. And they say basically, like, we put the mission first and we don't talk about politics or things basically going on in the world at the company. And I had to measure her on a scale of basically like 1 to 5 on how her behavior aligns with that. And I was shocked because I've never seen this from an organization, that in a reference that you're asking a person of their past behaviors or your experiences of bringing politics into work. And I also think that it was interesting that I was filling it out yesterday because of everything that is going on with the Supreme Court and Roe v. Wade. And I know a senior woman that works at Coinbase, and she said, these are the days that it's hard to work here, because these are the days that I want to talk about these things, that this is heavy. I don't have a place to get this out, but it's not a part of our culture. And so I had a very long conversation with the person who was applying. And so Garrett, it's one thing to take a neutral stance. It's another thing to just to not create space and to tell your employees to not discuss in the workplace. Like you are not to discuss. There's no space for it, and it is looked down upon. So yeah, I just thought that was like really interesting. And look, people are like, oh, so should they change that? This is what I think. I just want companies to be clear on where the line is so that we can all make our own choices of workplaces where we want to be. I personally would just never work at Coinbase. Right. And so when you know these things, then you can just make these choices. And there are organizations that have been very vocal about things or lack thereof, and they've lost talent because people have, people are choosing the type of environment that they want to be in. Yeah.
Trier, I know that you've got a hard stop, and I know we also want to be respectful of folks' time because we're right at the top of the hour. So these questions are going to keep coming. You've clearly got an engaged audience, which is an incredible thing. We're incredibly fortunate to learn from you and your expertise. Thank you for sharing. Sincerely, thank you for sharing.